Good morning, everyone. I am Jen Bordeaux, and this is another segment of Family Law Uncorked. Happy Friday for some of us or some of you who get to take tomorrow off in observance of Independence Day. So happy long weekend as well, and thanks for tuning in now or later, whenever you see this. Today is Thursday, July 2nd, and I always just throw out the date because they all run together, especially these days. But I am joined by two wonderful people today. Thank you guys so much for sharing your time with me. I'm joined by Casey Baine and Freddy Perkins, two therapists in probably anywhere right now with telehealth, but definitely in the Raleigh and Triangle area. So again, guys, thank you so much for joining me today for such an special and important topic. And I'd like to start off by asking you guys to each just introduce yourselves. And the type of therapy that you practice, whatever it is that you want to throw out there in the world to know. And Freddie, we'll start with you.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. It's so great to be included in the conversation. Like you've already said, my name's Freddy. I am a therapist. I'm specifically a music therapist. So I'm a board certified music therapist. Have been one now for going on 7 years, which is really weird to think about. In that time, I've worked with a lot of different types of people, whether it be kids and adults with intellectual disabilities or autism or folks with eating disorders or mental health needs or substance abuse needs, queer youth I've done a lot of work with. I feel like I've hit the big kind of population areas that people think about when they think about therapeutic needs in one way or another. I'm really interested in social justice work and specifically how therapy ties into that and how we as therapists contribute to oppressive systems and how we can kind of dismantle those systems and decolonize the way we look at therapy and the way we look at health and wellness in general. So yeah, I'm really thankful to be here. I am finishing up my master's degree right now in music therapy. I am all but thesis. I am excited to be done with school.
I bet.
And gone with the next part of my life. But yeah, that is kind of me in a nutshell. I live in Raleigh. I'm born in Chapel Hill, raised in Durham. Now I live in Raleigh, so I am Triangle native through and through.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you. I love all of those interests and what you're passionate about. That's great. So again, just thank you for sharing the time today, as well as from your experience and your passion to contribute to the conversation. And so Casey, what about you?
Hey, so I am Casey, and I am a therapist who has licenses both in mental health and substance use disorders. So that's a little bit different than a lot of therapists because oftentimes you'll just see them have one or the other license. My specialty is children and adolescents, which has proven very difficult to practice telehealth wise since having to shut down my brick and mortar space in Raleigh. So I think the angle is more working with parents now and involving the children via telehealth, because me doing telehealth with a 5-year-old it's
challenging.
It's a long session for some people.
Yeah.
So.
Awesome.
I'm glad to be here, by the way. Thanks for having me. And Jen, New Direction has sent referrals to me. I appreciate that. And I have sent referrals to you. I appreciate that. I know New Direction is a great practice to go visit if you're having the struggle of divorce. And I've personally attended like a music therapy session that Freddy did for therapists, and it's so great. I mean, he's just really so amazing. And anyway, I just wanted to give y'all both a shout out of just saying that y'all are great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's very sweet of you to say. And I gotta say, Freddie, I feel like I just listen to music as a form of therapy. So I can only imagine being able to engage in that as a true therapy practice would be amazing. So I'll have to check that out sometime. All right, well, let's dive into this topic, tips for talking to your children about racism, because it is real. I think that, I've been asked a couple of times, what I think the first step is in, working through this and being better and making progress. And I said, well, for a lot of people, it's accepting and admitting and realizing that it's real. And in doing that, as we are learning as adults, we can't ignore that our children are learning too, and they're learning from things that we indirectly and directly say to them, or behaviors that we model. And it is definitely us as adults and their parents. It is our responsibility to make sure that we are there to talk to them about these issues. I mean, to talk to them about, COVID obviously has been on everyone's minds as well. But now with social justice and really getting all this momentum, it can't be ignored for kids too. They need to understand what's going on, and we need to make sure that we're creating a safe space and an educational space to talk about these topics and not just ignore them. Because sometimes, yes, they can be uncomfortable conversations, but undoubtedly conversations that 100% need to be had. So that's what we are going to be talking about today. And from the family law world, and we'll get into this a little bit, very broadly, but in talking about tips to talk to your kids in general. But from the family law world, a lot of times you've got blended families, you've got step parents involved, you've got co-parents that may or may not co-parent well, very contentious situations. So kind of want to cover all of that, probably at a higher level, because we could probably sit here and talk about it for, for a very long time. But so I guess just in general, we'll start very broad. And I know you guys were featured together on ABC 11 as well. So congrats, because that's pretty cool.
That was fun.
So what would you guys say are just general tips in general for starting that conversation, having this conversation with your
children? I think a big thing to do when having these conversations is you have to recognize how you're situated in the conversation, right? So one of the things which I think we'll probably talk about a little bit later is kind of the differences between how white parents engage in race with their children or don't, and how Black parents or other parents of color interact with those conversations with their children. And I think you have to really recognize, where do you fall in that conversation. And that does not mean that you have to put yourself in this category of, well, are you a good person when it comes to race? Or are you a bad person when it comes to racism? I think so often we societally put ourselves in those boxes. I think that's happening right now with everything that's happening around police brutality and the recent murders of Black folks and Black trans folks. I think people, particularly white people, are putting themselves in these categories. Well, oh, I'm not racist because I don't do X, Y, and Z, and I would never do what these people are doing. And so they're creating these divisions within themselves of like the good people and the bad people. And at the end of the day, it's not about who's good and who's bad. It's about, how are you helping to maintain the systems that were put in place hundreds of years ago that are still in work today. And I think it's important to really consider that and let go of this need to feel good about yourself when it comes to race, and not being and being non-racist, and really focus on, well, how am I anti-racist, or how am I not anti-racist right now? And in a way, kind of giving yourself grace, because in a lot of ways, it is a lot of the things that we learn and are taught as children and then grow up with, that we do unconsciously, like we're unaware, we don't know what we don't know, right? And so it's important to, in a way, give yourself grace and say, hey, I realize that this X, Y, and Z that I'm doing can be really harmful to Black and Brown people. And I'm sorry. I recognize that it's harmful. I did not know it was harmful. And also, now that I know, I'm going to work towards being less harmful and doing close to minimal harm as I can do, and really trying to instill that in your children when you have those types of conversations.
Okay. Casey, anything you want to add to that? I think that's great, recognizing where you are, because you don't know where to go or what to say if you don't recognize where you are. So that's great. Thank you. Casey, anything to add to that?
Yeah, a lot. Well, first of all, brilliant. Thank you, Freddie. And I just wrote down a few notes to respond to what Freddie said. And also, I'm just, the way that I talk is a little bit more clinical. So then I'll share my response to your question. So first of all, to respond to what Freddie said, absolutely. Knowing where you're at, sure. That's a perfect starting point, just like self-awareness within yourself and within your family. But the need to feel good, I love that he brought up that, because uncomfortable emotions is what we're avoiding when we're avoiding uncomfortable conversations. And it is okay to feel uncomfortable. And that's one thing that, you know, any parent should be working on for themselves and working on for their children, is kind of like this distress tolerance, this ability to sit with discomfort and know that that feeling will pass. And truly, that's just your ego trying to get in the way. You know, just be open. Just know that they're just feelings, and feelings don't necessarily need to be good and bad. They can inform us and let us know, ooh, that triggered something in me. Maybe, you know, we do need to talk about it. And then, sorry, I have to respond to, something else that you said in the opening that was also brilliant, is that kids already, Jen, is what I'm saying, responding to you, kids already know stuff is going on.
Yeah.
So whether you're being separated, whether there's, you know, a divorce brewing, whether there is racism, and things that your family actively does within the home that contributes to racism, systemic racism, you know, all of those things, the kids, you know, they already know. So that was brilliant. Kids are more intuitive than we give them credit for. Parents like to shut off their emotions in front of kids and kind of be stoic and act like it's, you know, not okay to show any other emotion other than happiness and joy. But because parents don't want their kids to be uncomfortable. So I love the discomfort. So now I'll answer your question. Where to start? Y'all are just so brilliant. I just wanted to just expand on that. So my little clinical self needs to say, to start conversations, it's so important to use developmentally appropriate language. Like if you are talking above their head, they're not going to get it. So talking to a 3-year-old about white privilege, but talking to a 3-year-old about fairness, they will grab onto that, because a 3-year-old knows what's fair and what's not. So I think talking about that and talking about how different children have different skin colors and the reasoning for that, perhaps getting into melanin, that's probably way above a 3-year-old's head too. But I think starting with a developmentally appropriate language is definitely key.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, because they've got to be able to understand it. And I think the only thing that I would add to that too, maybe, and I'm not a therapist, disclaimer, but is making sure that parents are providing a space where kids feel comfortable to talk to them about these things. I mean, I know that kids haven't been in school for a while. This has really come to light with recent events, but knowing that they're on social media at such a young age. So obviously they're seeing it, or if their friends are talking to them about it, or if they see the news or something they're watching, there's some fantastic. I know that my brother and sister-in-law, my nephew, they're in a biracial relationship, and they've watched some of those movies on Netflix that were appropriate, nothing that was obviously, harming or too, vulgar and stuff like that, but to kind of create some of that dialogue and conversations with him to open that up. So there are some great resources there as well, but creating that environment to say, if you're feeling uncomfortable or you have questions about this, let's talk about it. You can come to me, or you can come to us if both parents are in the home. Let's talk about this. I think is so important, because if the kid doesn't feel safe to talk about general stuff, hard topics or anything that makes them feel uncomfortable is only going to add to that, and they're going to, I think, retract even more. So
absolutely.
Great tips for getting started. I love it. So Freddie, let's circle back to what you started talking about different conversations that need to be had in white households versus Black and brown households. And I'd even extend that to biracial or multi-race families, or, I know, friends that adopted children that were, that are a different color. So I feel like all these conversations in my mind are a little different. And so how does that work? What advice do you have there for different families that obviously have different makeups and looks?
So I think the first thing, well, before I hop into this, I'm going to preface this by saying I'm going to speak from my own experience as a Black person. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that, like, Black families in particular, and I would gesture to extend that to other families of color, we already have those conversations. Like, those things happen for us from the time we're old enough to understand things, right? So, like, I can remember times growing up being told certain things by my mother and having to accept it as truth. Like, one of the big things was, like, when we go to the store, you don't touch anything. Like, your hands are by your side, you stay with me, don't put your hands on it, you don't need to touch nothing. You can look, but you don't need to put your hands on anything. And at the time, like, as a child, obviously you don't relate that to being a racial thing, but, like, when you reflect on it as an adult, you're like, oh, I understand why, like, what that looks like to have a Black mother and her Black son, like, in a store, and already in some ways have a strike against them in terms of being in the store in the first place, and the suspicion that, oh, they're gonna come and steal something. And so, like, those conversations happen at an early age, from the way we're told we can act in public, from the way we are told we are supposed to dress in public, to when I was a teenager and starting to learn how to drive and having conversations about, like, when you get pulled over by the police, this is what you do. So those conversations for me in my household happen. Like, they come with the territory, right? So it's not that. That's the thing that I think is so interesting with everything that's going on, is, right, because everything is so much in the forefront of the news now, that for white people it's like, it seems like it's this big thing that's just all of a sudden happened, and it's so, like, critical right now, whereas for a Black and brown person, like, this has been the narrative. Like, we have seen this. It never went away. Like, we always think about it. It's always there. We don't have the privilege to not talk about it, because it comes with being minoritized. And I think that is a big part about it. Whereas white families, you have the privilege to not have to talk about race, because you're not directly impacted by the systems that work against Black and brown people and Black and brown faces. You benefit. So, right. So, like, it takes understanding as someone in a dominant culture, regardless of whether we're talking about race or whether we're talking about trans rights, whether we're talking about anything. If wherever you fall in the dominant culture, you have to first understand that the systems that you benefit from don't actually benefit you. When you learn that you don't actually benefit in the ways that you think you benefit, then that's when you start wanting change to happen. And that's why we see so much pushback from people who aren't as open minded to the idea, or people who are really defensive when you start talking about race, because you're challenging a way of thinking that they have known to be true for a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, for up to 70 decades, depending on how old the individual is. So when it comes to talking about race with your family, like for families of color, it's already happening. It's already a thing. So there's nothing different that needs to happen, because we're already doing it. It's already happened. And for us, it's a way of protection, like preserving. Like, this is how you survive in a world that was not made with you in mind, that was not created with your best interest or your needs being considered. So for white families, like, just having the conversation is a big deal. But I want to touch on something Casey said. Like, she mentioned, like, using developmentally appropriate language. I think that's totally on the mark. I think that's really appropriate. But I also think it's much more than having physical conversation, like word. It's much more than that. Like, Casey can attest to this too. Like, developmentally, children learn. Like, if we look at social learning theory, children learn by what they see. Children learn by what happens around them. And so when they watch TV shows that portray Black people in a certain light, or when they see, if they're with mom at the store, or if they're a mom walking down the street and a Black person is walking down the same street and mom says, okay, we need to cross the street, children are seeing that. When you are, if they're listening to music that is predominantly sung by Black artists, and the parent thinks that that music's inappropriate and you have to change the song because that's not what we listen to, and instead they say, we're going to listen to Joni Mitchell instead. Like, they are seeing and hearing what's happening. They're learning by what they see. So as a parent, yes, it's important to physically have those conversations and talk to them when, of course, they're at a developmental level to kind of understand some of the concepts and terms. But you also have to show them through your own what how to how racism works and how you see racism. So some good ways to look at it is like, look at children's books. Like, when you go to the store, when you go to Barnes and Noble and you pick out children's books, who are those books catered to? Like, who are those books written for and written with in mind? Like, some of that has changed. Like, there's some really great books out there for kids now, like Hair Love by Matthew Cherry, or I Am Perfectly Designed by Karamo Brown, which lift up the Black experience and lift up, like, what it means to be Black in a white world. And so, like, or when you're at Target and your child wants a doll, if your child wants a Barbie doll or some kind of doll, and the first doll you grab for them is a white one, like, that's telling them something too. Like, when you are able to expose your children to the things that show them that someone who looks different than them does not mean that that person's less than, or does not mean that they're bad, or not beautiful, or not, insert adjective here. That's how children learn.
Absolutely.
All of that. I'm like, just don't stop talking. Just keep going. Like, I'm so enthralled. I love it. Thank you. Casey, I could see you over there writing down. So
I can't help it. Yeah. Well, Freddie, obviously brilliant points. And right after our ABC 11 interview, I wanted to text you so bad, but I was like, okay, I'm going to be getting Freddie. I wanted to text him, but I'm like, I'll probably get so many other comments. I'm not going to bug him. But him on that interview, he mentioned getting Black and brown dolls if you just have white dolls in your family's repertoire of toys. And one of my clients who watched that interview immediately texted me and said she was on the way to get her white girls some brown dolls. So it's like the little ripples that we're making actually make a bigger impact. So, you know, tips to get things started. Number one, developmentally appropriate language. But number two, absolutely modeling. That's what he's saying. He's saying modeling. He's saying that parents need to evaluate themselves and evaluate their homes and discuss about how they live their life and why they live their life that way. And then for conversations being different between white, Black, brown, biracial, absolutely. Oh, so that's why I actually reached out to news stations the first week when the protests began after George Floyd was murdered. I had lots of hard conversations with parents and my teenagers about race and racism, and it was quite painful. And so, for instance, like a white family, the discussion had never come up about race. They have Black and brown family member. I don't know about family members. I think that they might have a biracial family member, but it was like they've integrated multiculturalism into their own family already, and hadn't had the conversation because they were just kind of living it out. But they still need to have the conversation. Like, we still need to talk about it. We need to talk about what's going on, and we need to talk about why we live our lives in that way. So modeling, reading books, you know, that are age appropriate, obviously. I think language is so important. That language is important to me as a therapist, to make sure that I am not being offensive or making a client feel less than in the moment. And like Freddy has already enlightened me, like I discussed the word minority with him, and like he's like, I don't consider myself a minority. I consider myself minoritized. And that's so true. White people are like this much of the planet. Oh my gosh. Most of them are Black and brown, but you know, we call them the minorities, right? So that's something that I'm working on changing in my language right now. And unlearning is another thing. We can talk about unlearning and in our families. My husband has been building homes for 20 plus years, and on plans now, it says owner suite or primary bedroom as opposed to master bedroom now. And for me and my whiteness, I had never considered it, and now I find the word master bedroom so offensive I can't even stand it.
That hits home for me because I'm actually in the house buying process right now, searching, and yeah, same here. Something I never even, you know, but small things like that, and challenging yourself, you know, taking that and, like you said, unlearning, and then the ripple that has for you, I think only naturally will pass on to your children as well. And that obviously that just pushes it out for future generations, hopefully. Yeah, so those are all powerful and great things. So last question I want to pose before we wrap things up is about co-parenting situations. So a lot of times, like I said, in family law, we have, obviously a household has been split, and if both parents are still involved in the child's life, which more times than not that they are, or the courts at least like to really see that. And so, but co-parents sometimes are really, really great. They weren't great as husband and wife, but they're phenomenal co-parents. Other times, not so much. They can't see eye to eye on anything, and argue about every tiny little thing. And then you've also got blended families where you bring step parents in at one point. So I want to focus on the parents that can't get along when it comes to co-parenting. They cannot actively or productively co-parent. So what advice do you have for that situation in talking to children? Because I can just see parents having different opinions on this, or, you know, if they have unfortunate, you know, racist ideology compared, and you've got one parent that's not, and it's maybe trying to unlearn and change it and do better. How do you work with that with your kids? That's got to be tough.
I wish
Freddie?
a perfect answer to that question, but I mean, here's the thing. Like, as a parent, and this is all assumptive because I'm not a parent and I recognize that. As a parent, my best guess is you can only do as best as you can do for your child. Like, you can't control what other people are going to do and how other people are going to interact with your child. And so when it comes to that, you have to instill what you believe to be the best for your child, right? And then at a certain point, your child gets old enough to be able to make their own decisions, and is able to see things from their own perspective because they start to gain their own kind of lens and they become a little bit more independent from their parents. And so I guess for me, the thing that I guess logistically makes the most sense is proceed as you would proceed as you feel like you need to proceed. Like, if you're the parent that is working hard towards being anti-racist and you want to instill that in your child, great, do that. They're going to take something from that. Even if there's another parent that is working against that, it's not like it's not going to undo anything. It may very well cause inner conflict for your child, but at a certain point, they start to be able to discern and make decisions for themselves. And I think that's another way too. I think that's important to recognize too, is that I think parents in some ways think about their children as like the way that I interact with them is doing to them or doing for them, as opposed to like doing with them and letting them also be a part of that journey and that collaboration, which is not to say that that's problematic in any way. It's maybe not as effective. I think we're taught that parents know everything. Parents know best, and so we should always listen to parents and what they have to say. And in some respect, that's very factual and very true. And in other ways, like, sometimes parents need to be challenged as
Parents are human too.
right. Like, they're not
I need to be challenged.
right.
Yeah.
They're not omnipotent forces that know everything. Like, even in my relationship with my mother, like, I grew up an only child, and so I took what my mother had to say as like gospel truth for a good while, and it's not been until recently, through my own work in therapy and like just living my life, learning like, oh, I can challenge this, and like reflecting on this. In my childhood, this didn't feel right, or I can't continue to live up to this belief system that we had in place when I was younger. And I challenge her on it now, and she starts to see now that maybe that was not the best way, but at the time that's all she knew. And I think that brings to like bigger issues of like intergenerational trauma and things that you learn when you're a child, and then what you pass on to your children when you become a parent. So there's a lot of big things within that conversation. But when it comes down to it, I say that as parents, you can only do the best that you can do, and you can actively also work to learn and also and be open-minded to expanding upon your own knowledge base. So I think it's this duality of continuing to see yourself as a learner and a student, while also working with your child to learn those things together, right?
Casey?
Remaining teachable. So I'm excited because I have a little prop to answer your question.
Who doesn't love a good prop?
Hey, can y'all see? It's a hula hoop. And a lot of my work is with children from homes that are in process of separation. There's transitions due to the children being foster children. They go back to their foster parents, and then they come back into the home. And there's this very big dysregulation in the households, between the households, because there's, you know, a relationship ended or something happened for them to be separated. Therefore, there's fundamental differences. And that is so difficult. So difficult. And I experienced that growing up, not to the frequency that children experience it that like they do today, which is often joint custody, 50-50, 1 week here, 1 week there. I just got it like during the summers. It's like you have to reframe your brain when you're in that environment. And so some parents, some children may find that they have white supremacist parents. That might be why the relationship ended. And I'll just go back to say what Freddy said is that you can only control what's like inside your hula hoop, is what I tell clients or little kids, just because they're concrete and can use a tool. Like if you can pick out what you can and cannot control, can you control stuff inside your hula hoop, or can you control stuff outside of your hula hoop? And that tool is good for that racism discussion, because if you are a parent or caregiver trying to implement anti-racism in your family, you can only do so much. You can only do what you can do, and you have to separate the stuff you can't control. So Freddy was right. He said it.
I mean, and I'll say to anyone that might be watching that is struggling with how do I initiate this conversation or have this conversation, or how do I work through having a co-parent that doesn't see eye to eye, or I'm struggling with accepting the things that I can control and focusing on that, so to speak. There's help. There are 2 people on the screen right here.
Yes!
Provide help.
I am accepting clients.
Yeah. So, I mean, I can't say enough about, I mean, I've seen a therapist. I went through a divorce a couple years ago and saw a therapist, and she changed my perspective on so much. And for people that come into our doors at New Direction, the attorneys always recommend that they see a therapist. Sometimes it's court ordered, especially for children. But we recommend, and that's through networking. That's how I met Casey, and now I've met Freddy. But we always recommend that, because emotional stuff sucks sometimes, and you got to have some help to unpack it all and, you know, organize it a little bit so that you can attack one thing at a time, because, you know, it can be so overwhelming and seem like such this big ball of mess, and you just got to start pulling those rubber bands out to detangle it. And this is no different. Talking about racism, I mean, it's a lot for, you know, communities of color. It's a lot for white people too, because there's some different feelings associated that maybe they've never felt before. Like, you know, feeling a little bit of feeling some shame and some guilt for not seeing these things, not recognizing these things, not admitting these things. And that needs to be felt. It's a natural process, and it needs to be felt to move past it. You got to feel it to heal it, is what I always say. So
Yes.
help is out there, and please access mental health therapists, counselors for your children, for you, all together as a family, if there. So, guys, any closing words before we wrap up that you want to say before we head out for the day?
I think it's just important to recognize that no one's perfect at this. Like, even Black people, brown people, people of color, like, we're not perfect at this. Like, we have shortcomings. We have a certain lens point, because in a lot of ways we face it head on, but we're not perfect by any means at it. So there's always room for anyone to grow and to learn, as long as you're willing and wanting to be a learner in the process. And it's important to be collaborative in that process. Like I think what you touched on is important. Like, you don't have to do it alone. Like, there's some things you inevitably have to do alone, right? Like, you have to be reflexive. You have to sift through your own stuff and work through, like, things that may need to change and things that may be problematic in how you carry and navigate your world. But, like, you can share those things with other people, because I think so often in mental health in general, I think we have such stigma around imperfection and being less than when it comes to our experiences, whether it's someone with a specific diagnosis, how we view that, or if it's someone that is showing something that does not fit the societal standard, the instinct is to hide it and not share it and talk about it because we feel we'll be ostracized or we'll be othered, right? But if we can work past that hang up and work past that ego and work past that dichotomous way of thinking of being good and bad and have these conversations and talk about our shortcomings and show vulnerability, you'll be surprised how many other people feel very similarly to you in a lot of these ways of being. And you'll find that you start to build community in that way when you can share and be vulnerable and express your fears, express your anxieties, express your shortcomings, talk about your privileges, talk about your deficits when it comes to privileges like that. I Yeah, you just got to be willing to show that vulnerability.
And it's not easy all the time. Most of the time it's not easy, but it's necessary. And there's such a strength and resiliency that comes after you expose yourself and you show that vulnerability, and then you see this team that starts to stand around you because others, can relate and say, hey, yeah, me too. And then there's just a strength that forms from that. And then there's a strength that you form within yourself. So I love that, you speaking to vulnerability. Casey, anything from you to wrap up?
Everything Freddy said.
Know.
But yeah, vulnerability is uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean that it's not good. And so vulnerability, being open, remaining teachable, accepting feedback to the point where it's not an attack on your character. And I'll let y'all know, right before the little interview on ABC 11, I accepted feedback from Freddy. And apparently I whispered Black people instead of just saying Black people. And I didn't realize that I had done it. Like, it was just like something that I do. And Freddy was like, you don't have to whisper Black people. And I was like, shit. Sorry.
No, you're fine.
But anyway, it's like, so as a white female, I was like wanting to apologize and just, I just felt terrible and like that sort of thing. Shame and guilt and stuff like that, those are also just emotions that you can distance yourself from, your ego from, and just say, sometimes I whisper Black people without realizing it. And so now, Freddy, do you think that I'm aware of my whispering?
Probably, I would say. I would hope so.
I'm still talking about it today. So I'm okay with my learning and unlearning. Being okay with it is the openness and the teachable spirit that people need right now.
I think that's a big thing too, Casey, that you're bringing up, is this idea that we have to learn that people aren't fixed. Like, we're not fixed individuals. Like, we can change and grow. I think especially right now, we live in a time where cancel culture is real and everyone is quick to cut somebody out if they even show one shred of something that's problematic, and they're not able to view and allow people to change from a moment, from a decision, from a behavior, and unable to trust that they can grow and change and be authentic in that growth and change. I think that is something that we as a society need to be better at, is recognizing that people can change if they put forth the effort and the willingness and are able to hold themselves accountable and accept being held accountable by other people. I think that's another big word to kind of bring into this conversation, is accountability.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I'll let Freddie be my accountability partner for my whiteness. I will accept his feedback, and I will try not to let my ego get in the way, and I will try not to over apologize, because that's what makes it about me. So have at it, Freddie. Anytime you catch me, I'm gonna let you do it. Tell me.
Correct. Yeah, and again, I know the focus of this conversation is race, but there's so many other issues that revolve around similar types of conversations.
Mhm.
Like, I think when it comes to transphobia and trans folks, like, these conversations need to happen. When it comes to classism, these conversations need to happen. When it comes to sexism and cisgenderism, like, these conversations need to happen. And like, not all at once, because that's a lot.
That's a lot.
But like, these things need to happen because so many people are being affected in negative ways, whether it's Black cis people and Black trans people being murdered on a daily basis, whether it's the fact that we're now living in 2020 and the Supreme Court just now passed a ruling that says queer people can't be fired from their jobs just for being queer. Like, these are things that have for too long existed, and people who are in positions of power need to be held accountable and need to have these conversations. And the purpose is not to make people feel bad. The purpose is not to shame people. The purpose is for you to listen and to attune to these voices that so badly and so often speak up, but even more often go unheard. No one's listening.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree, and thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, there are a lot of conversations that need to be had, period, and more frequently, and just to work so that everybody can be human and everybody can live their life in peace, and
Yes.
there not be a greater than or a less than, just the equal sign. So thank you guys so much for joining me today. I think that's a great point to wrap it up at. And I've thoroughly enjoyed this, and I've learned just in the time that we've been sitting here. So thank you so much. I hope those watching have learned something, feel comfortable in starting these conversations with your children or other family members, because not just the kids need to be having these conversations. So again, thank you guys so much. I really can't thank you enough for devoting some of your time to me today. Stay safe. Stay sane, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye, Freddie. Bye, Jen.
Bye.